Thank you to all those helping make this channel financially viable. In 1999, Chinese military colonels Qiao Liang and Wang Xiangsui published a book called Unrestricted Warfare, two Air Force senior colonels on scenarios for war and the operational art in an era of globalization. Spurred on by the Third Taiwan Straits crisis, the book argues that the Gulf War of 1991 ushered in a new age of warfare that, with the increasing levels of globalization, necessitated a departure from previous ideas about what conflict is and the limits on how it can be waged. In a sense, warfare was unrestricted in that it's not just restricted to the battlefield, but now also encompasses cyberspace, financial settings, and things like that. In this video, I'm not going to do a blow-by-blow account of the book and its arguments, because essentially the summary I just gave you is basically it. It's a very long book, which I feel could have been made much shorter and more to the point if the authors edited out a bunch of stuff that wasn't really that important to explain pretty simple concepts. What I want to talk very briefly about instead is how much the book's importance has been blown out of proportion. It's really not that groundbreaking a work. It's a book written by military men who recognise that their government was militarily weaker than the US government and suggest ways that they can get around this, such as computer hacking, but in no way are creating anything other than what is essentially an opinion piece. Firstly, we should start with the name. Unrestricted Warfare, two Air Force senior colonels on scenarios for war and the operational art in an era of globalization. This, however, is not how the book has been introduced to many people, but instead as China's master plan to destroy America, either accompanied by images of a representation of the USA asleep with the caption "Wake up America," or a picture of the Twin Towers exploding on 9/11. We need to talk about the foreword to this translation of the book. It begins by saying that Unrestricted Warfare is the People's Liberation Army manual for asymmetric warfare and the waging of war, strategically and tactically. This is not true. The Chinese military did not, and to this day has not, adopted unrestricted warfare as official policy. One analyst has claimed that to suggest it is would be problematic, and that the book is unoriginal, not authoritative, both the authors themselves and examples from history contradict their thesis, and much of the writing is designed to sound profound, but falls flat under closer examination. Moreover, the authors do not provide an applicable plan for a military to follow. As the analysis points out, and as becomes very clear when actually reading the book, much of the word count is the author's opinions about how war has changed, particularly drawing on the lessons of the 1991 Gulf War, and much of what they cite comes from American government or military sources. They believe that war was the monopoly of soldiers and armies right up to the 1990s, when technology and globalization changed all of that and turned the entire world into a battlefield. This is, of course, not reflective of how war actually manifested throughout history. There's always been psychological warfare and economic warfare, and these things didn't just magic themselves into existence in the 1990s because the US government used a stealth bomber. It should also be pointed out that this book wasn't intended to be a master plan. The authors are just stating their opinions and arguing that a change in perspective is needed for the modern world. The book isn't written for the government or military with the intention of creating a new doctrine for the 21st century, and the authors readily admit that they wrote this just as a venue for their opinions. As a result of the Third Taiwan Straits crisis, people were suddenly moved to think up strategies when facing a situation. We therefore decided to write this book, a book which would be able to concentrate together the concerns and thoughts each of us had over the past several decades, and especially during the last 10 years concerning military issues. Anyway, the foreword to China's Master Plan to Destroy America seems to suggest that the author is understanding what the two Chinese officers wrote through the lens of fear about communist infiltration, saying their book is a manual for a slow but inexorable assault on an enemy's institutions, often without the enemy's knowledge that it is even being attacked. Which, again, isn't true. Qiao and Wang put a lot of emphasis on computers, and specifically hacking, allowing ordinary people to disrupt, damage, and disable governments anytime, anywhere, without even having to get out of bed in the morning. What is interesting about hacking, they argue, is the proportional response dilemma. Naturally, an intrusion by a teenager playing a game cannot be regarded as an act of war. The problem is, how does one know for certain which damage is the result of games and which damage is the result of warfare? They are arguing that they believe acts of war in a globalized age are much more fluid and not as clearly defined as they were historically, almost by their very nature. As such, any moves undertaken outside the realms of guns and bombs, like tanking another country's financial markets, could be seen as an attack on that nation, but that it would be ambiguous as to whether it was designed as an attack or not, putting the government in a tricky position. They're not saying that every single move should be taken with the assumption that the enemy will never even know they're being attacked, but rather that the realities of the modern world mean that actions which create that effect exist in all different areas of life and can be taken advantage of. The foreword goes on to mention, from their reading of the book, that the Chinese government will favour trade wars as a way to undermine and attack the US economy. It is true that Qiao and Wang wrote that in their opinions, trade wars will become the favoured type of non-military wars in the 21st century. But, firstly, they used the US government as the prime example, who they say have perfected trade wars to a fine art, citing the post-Gulf War trade embargo against Iraq as the most classic textbook example of a modern trade war. And, secondly, the book never became official doctrine, so it doesn't really matter anyway what Qiao and Wang believed about trade wars, because their work has no real bearing on Chinese government policy. 1 year after the foreword was written, it was actually the US government under the Trump administration which launched a trade war against the Chinese government, just out of interest. To attempt to prove that the Chinese Communist Party is waging economic warfare against the American economy, the foreword argues, consider how many American products are manufactured in Chinese factories by low-wage workers who undercut American labour. While the American consumer might be thrilled at the low prices of goods coming into the United States, the American labour market suffers, thus causing dissatisfaction among a vital voting constituency. While they aren't wrong that labour is much cheaper in countries outside America, this isn't necessarily because of some scheme by the Chinese government to undermine the West. They just have far less standards, and business people looking to make more profit are drawn towards getting their products made in a country where you only have to pay, say, $1 an hour instead of 10. The main problem here is business people caring more about making money for themselves than about their workers having good lives, because they exist in an economic system which prioritises profit over people, not because of communist economic warfare. That's not to say that the Chinese government isn't trying to become the manufacturing centre of the world, but just that the Western business people who profit from this are also making a decision based on their own self-interest. Slightly out of subject, but one thing I actually find really interesting is that the foreword criticises Trump running for president in 2015 and 16 in part on a platform of opposing the Chinese government economically, while also having so many of his own products produced in China rather than America. The foreword not so subtly implies that Trump was backed by the Chinese government by saying, "A country waging an economic war that is savvy about its enemy population's proclivities can tailor its policies to engender unrest in that population so as to propel the election of that country's leaders who might be more easily manipulated. We saw this in the 2016 presidential election." To skip through a bunch of stuff, the foreword ends by saying, China learned to play the 18th and 19th century game of creating economic spheres of influence. Hence, it is establishing sources of raw materials from countries where it is wielding its economic influence, an influence born out of its luring manufacturing to its shores. The Chinese Communist government, playing a capitalist long game, knows that thinking in decades rather than 4-year election cycles plays to its benefit. Is this mostly true? Sure, though economic spheres of influence are much older than the 18th and 19th centuries. Plus, economic spheres of influence are something lots of governments do, and are not unique to the Chinese government. Also, this doesn't have anything to do with the book Unrestricted Warfare. Qiao and Wang's ideas don't involve schemes to bring manufacturing away from America and into China, didn't become policy, and the Chinese government had economic spheres of influence long before they wrote their book in 1999. Oh, by the way, the last few lines of this foreword are literally, "This book should be regarded as the playbook for the destruction of not only the United States, but of Western democracies in general. Be afraid, be very afraid." Again, no, it shouldn't be taken as that, because it's essentially a long rambling and, in my opinion, not very well put together opinion piece that's never become official policy because, in reality, it doesn't really even offer any policy ideas, nor was it intended to. It just says, this is the world now as we see things. I don't want to make it sound like the Chinese government, which is a dictatorship, is actually innocent of any and all interference, espionage, and things like that. Just recently, I read a news article which mentioned how the Chinese government operates secret police stations in at least 21 countries around the world which target Chinese dissidents. However, a lot of people who've come across Unrestricted Warfare seem to take it out of context and imagine that not only is it official policy, which again it isn't because it's not a policy recommendation, but that it is being actively assisted by agents within their own governments, normally blaming Joe Biden, or decry specific plots without any evidence to back it up, normally about coronavirus. On the website of the Sri Lankan Colombo Gazette, for example, one article claims that COVID-19 is a Chinese government attack, and that China's quest for achieving status of global power by employing bioweapons was succinctly outlined by Liang and Wang Xiangsui. China is at war with other countries to whom it considers a potential enemy, though in a silent war by employing bioweapons. Again, though, this isn't true. First of all, there is absolutely no solid, credible evidence that COVID-19 was anything other than a natural occurrence resulting from animal farming, plus what Qiao and Wang actually say about biological warfare can't even be understood as pushing for it. First, in discussing how they believe that globalization has basically turned everything into a weapon, they state that biological weapons are nothing more than non-traditional weapons whose mechanisms have been altered and whose lethal power and destructive capabilities have been magnified several times over. They also mention that in 1997, the US Department of Defense believed that it may face the challenge of biological weapons in future. Nowhere in the book do they specifically say that it should be used, just that it exists. More to the point, none of this even really matters because their book is not official policy. It's an opinion piece and not an official government paper. Even if they had specifically written, "We should infect the entire world with coronavirus that will also kill thousands of our own people and force us into social lockdowns which will harm our own economic growth," this wouldn't actually matter because these people have no say in government policy. Recently, retired US Army General David Petraeus has been appearing on various news networks, giving his opinion on the Russo-Ukrainian war and potential US government responses to any tactical nuclear weapon use by the Russian government. Arguing that unrestricted warfare is official Chinese military policy would be like saying that anything Petraeus says on TV is now official Biden administration policy. It's inaccurate and a bit silly. Even more so when we consider that the publisher of the book, PLA Literature and Arts Publishing House, is, according to one analyst, known for publishing military entertainment. While there is not one publisher that has any sole command on what is authoritative out of the PLA, it would be extremely unlikely that this particular publisher would produce something authoritative. Some translations of Qiao and Wang's book, entitled China's Master Plan, show a photo of 9/11, and I think that this is an important thing to talk about for a bit because there are some people who genuinely believe that the Chinese government was behind 9/11 and that this is because of the book Unrestricted Warfare. Osama bin Laden's name is mentioned over a dozen times in the book, which at one point describes him as a maniac. For many people, proof that 9/11 was being foretold in the book comes on pages 144 to 145, of the translation I have anyway, where the authors say of new threats facing the US government that they could come in the form of the intrusions of hackers, a major explosion at the World Trade Center, or a bombing attack by Bin Laden. However, this isn't really proof of anything. First of all, as I've repeatedly said, because the book is nothing but an opinion piece and in no way a policy outline. Secondly, and as many people often forget today, because Osama bin Laden was already a well-known figure in 1999 when the book was published, due to his involvement in the 1998 Kenya and Tanzania US embassy bombings. The mention of a bomb at the World Trade Center is also not an indication of things to come, but a reference to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Plus, if people really want it, I can make a video about it, but we know full well why Osama bin Laden did eventually commit the 9/11 attacks, and it wasn't because the Chinese communists got him to do it. The Chinese government's long-term strategic goal is to become a global superpower by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party coming to power. To do this, they've mostly been going the non-confrontational economic integration route, such as constructing infrastructure projects across the world through the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. Alongside this, they've been creating a large, conventional military force to rival that of the United States government. Much like Qiao and Wang, the government and military felt that the 1991 Gulf War offered a potential glimpse into the wars of the future. While the two authors believed that this glimpse showed that conventional military engagements were far less relevant and that things like cyber and financial warfare were the future, the Chinese government and military believed, and had been moving towards this point since the 1980s already, that the war confirmed that the future lay in modern conventional military technologies, like laser-guided weapons and stealth bombers, that could act as force multipliers and keep wars limited in scope, short in duration, and as least costly as possible to themselves. In a hypothetical war of the US government, that's exactly the sort of conflict that the Chinese government wanted, because they felt that they wouldn't be able to outlast the economic, logistical, or military resources of the US government. As one Chinese military textbook would later put it, the guiding principle of strategy and planning should be controlling the scale and intensity of war. In 1993, the military unveiled a new doctrine called Winning Local Wars Under High Technology Conditions, which, in large part, sought to emulate the US military's way of war in light of the Gulf War. It not only advocated limited warfare using professional troops and all of the newly available technologies, but also greater cooperation and coordination as being essential for the Chinese military to use to their advantage and in order to negate their own disadvantages. They've updated this conventionally focused doctrine many times since. It is true that the Chinese government does engage in espionage, and funding insurgent groups, and computer hacking, and things like that. It is also true that these things were mentioned in Unrestricted Warfare. However, first of all, they are not unique in doing these things. Secondly, most of these things aren't new and have already existed for thousands of years. Thirdly, the Chinese government is not using unrestricted warfare as a doctrine because it isn't one. It's not a policy outline, it's an opinion. It has never been policy because it doesn't really even offer any real recommendations, but more like, we think the nature of war has inherently changed, and here's how. And again, I'd actually like to say that, at least to me, the book isn't as enlightening or impressive as some people make out. Maybe it's also down to translation issues, but I personally didn't even find it very enjoyable to read, and it really takes a while to get to the points it's trying to make. As the analysis I've kept mentioning argues, boiling unrestricted warfare down to its core, the basic message is nations should not be restricted when thinking about how to win wars, and wars are not the sole responsibility of the military. This is not unique to modern warfare, as even the authors point out, nor useful information in any meaningful way. Unrestricted warfare is defined in such a nebulous manner that almost anything could be considered unrestricted warfare, such as the battlefield is everywhere and everything is changing. If China is indeed calculating their strategy based on the golden ratio and searching for the rules hidden in the waves of the military practice of mankind, the US would be in a much better strategic position. The CCP leadership is not incompetent, and the US military and policymakers cannot gamble that China's strategy is based on unrestricted warfare. Unrestricted warfare is not a textbook or a master plan to lead China in conflict against the US, and never was intended to be. So, no, the Chinese government is not waging constant, covert, unrestricted warfare, with their plans right out in the open, freely available on the internet in PDF format. I understand why people do believe so strongly that this book holds the keys to so many of the events they see around them, but no. Covert operations do exist, and the Chinese government does very much seem to want to replace the US government as the leading power in the world. But the written opinion of two Chinese colonels from 1999 who felt disempowered after the Third Taiwan Straits crisis doesn't have any bearing on current-day policy in the 2020s. Even if there are similarities, correlation does not equal causation. Unrestricted warfare is not the Chinese Communist Party's master plan to destroy America, and anyone who tells you that it is official policy, or who links it to current events like coronavirus, is wrong.